Now I'm joined in the studio by former Australian High Commissioner to the UK and former Australian Attorney General George Brandis. Now, George, lovely to see you.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
I know you were heavily involved as Attorney General with the plan to stop the boats in Australia. Tell me how that worked and what the government needs to do to make their own policy work on this, George.
Well, a number of measures were put in place by the Australian government under the leadership of then Prime Minister Abbott, of which are offshore processing, which I know the United Kingdom is having a big debate about at the moment, was a key element of that suite of policies. But basically, Camilla, it also took a lot of political will. I've in London in the last couple of weeks. I've followed this debate, and it is so reminiscent of the debate that we had in Australia in 2013 and 2014. But that debate dried up when the boats stopped.
Yes.
And the boats did stop.
But there was heavy opposition. I mean, I was going to ask you about what you made of the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about the Rwanda plan, saying that it's immoral. Presumably Australia also had opposition from churches, the left, everybody, but you went ahead with it nonetheless.
And the policy was so successful that the Labor Party, which was then the opposition, was shamed into doing a U-turn and adopting it, so that it is now the bipartisan policy of Australian governments, both sides of Australian politics. Now, as to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is, of course, a good man, I do think it's wise that senior clergymen stay out of politics, frankly.
Yes. Now, looking at the policy itself as it is today, I mean, do you support the Rwanda policy in principle? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I don't have enough granular knowledge of it to say that without any hesitation, but what I do support, because it was successful in Australia, is the principle of offshore processing. Because when somebody comes to a country claiming to be a refugee, the obligation of that country, it's not to settle them, it's not to refool them to the place from which they claim they were fleeing persecution. And that obligation can be discharged either in the country to which they come, or in another country, in Australia, in Nauru, a nation in the South Pacific, in which we have entered into an offshore processing agreement.
But the idea is it's a deterrent, right?
Well, what you have to do, and let's call this for what it is. This is people smuggling.
Yeah.
And people smuggling is one of the most evil and insidious forms of international crime. And it really annoys me that people, including good people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, approach this as if it were something other than an attempt by the UK government to deal with this evil crime of people smuggling. The way you deal with people smuggling, the way that it worked in Australia, is to put the people smugglers out of business. And the way you put the people smugglers out of business is to ensure that they do not have a product to sell.
But then you have the criticism from the left, which will be, well, people don't have safe and legal routes, so they have to resort to these dangerous crossings across the channel in barely inflatable dinghies, and therefore the government isn't doing enough generally on the picture of migration. Having said that, I don't know if you've seen in the week, but the figure that is about to be announced in 2 weeks' time is that net migration is going to hit 1 million. What's your view from an Australian looking at the UK? Is that an acceptable number of migrants to be coming into this country, do you think?
I do not have a view as to what should be the right size of the UK population. And the Australian experience and the UK experience are quite different. Because in the United Kingdom, there is not a very big lobby, as far as I can see, that says that the population of Britain should be much bigger than it is. I mean, this is a relatively small country geographically, and it's quite crowded. In Australia, it is the opposite. We are a nation the size of the continental United States, but with a population of only 26 million people. So you don't get a debate in Australia about whether Australia is full. The debate is about how many more new migrants we should take in, rather than whether we should take in additional numbers at all. But the point here is about sovereignty. The Australian policy was called Operation Sovereign Borders, and that was a reflection of the fact that whatever is the optimal size of a nation's population, to the extent to which an important component of that population is migration intake, It is for that country to decide and police who's entitled to become a citizen.
Yes.
And the former Australian Prime Minister John Howard put it very well in a phrase that became almost iconic in Australia. He acknowledged Australia's humanitarian obligations, which, by the way, we fulfil more generously than most countries in the world. But then he went on to say, but we will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come. Now, that absolutely captured a public sentiment that I believe is as much in evidence in the United Kingdom as it was in Australia. People, I'm sure, good people, people of good faith, have no objection to providing providing help for genuine refugees, so long as the government controls the sovereignty of your borders.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak should therefore be a bit more Howard-esque in his language? I mean, is he being tough enough on this? What advice would you give him?
Well, look, it's not, Camilla, it's not for me to advise. I
know, but you're a very experienced politician, and therefore you'll be observing how he's handled it. And I'm wondering whether you think his handling is correct, because as you say, it was delicate for Abbott. You know, he had a huge amount of criticism.
Yeah, well, he did, but I mean, one of the things about Tony Abbott is he is a political tough guy with tremendous willpower. Now, I've met Mr Sunak, but I don't claim to know him well. I think what matters more than the language is the firmness of purpose with which the policy is prosecuted, and on that score, it seems to me that Mr Sunak and his government are firm.
What else did you think about Mr Sunak when you met him, out of interest?
I think Mr Sunak's obviously a highly, highly competent individual, and the United Kingdom, you know, should be glad to have him, frankly, as your Prime Minister, because there are a lot of nations in the world which would love to have a Conservative Prime Minister as hugely competent and skillful as Rishi Sunak.
And hard-working, to be fair, to the Prime Minister.